Bishop Spong will be speaking today on the story of Judas Iscariot, not a character of history, but a composite figure drawn from many sources. Bishop Spong, once again, we are grateful for your presence. I think I almost need not say that, the audience tells you that. And again to Warren Martin, thank you, Warren, for your generosity and for making this possible. Let us welcome to the podium Bishop John Shelby Spong.
See, Warren Martin endows this lectureship and he gets a front row seat. As Jesus said, go and do thou likewise. I wonder how many of you can name Santa Claus's reindeer? Raise your hands. You think you can name all of them? How many of you can name the 12 apostles? Raise your hands. That's sort of interesting, isn't it? I suspect that naming the 12 apostles would be much harder for most people than Santa Claus's reindeer. And even beyond naming them, we can tell you almost nothing about them because there's almost nothing about them in the Bible. Oh, we know a little bit about Simon Peter, and James and John, and Judas Iscariot, but they are the only ones that have some biographical content. When one gets to the fourth gospel, some of the minor apostles get a little bit of space. Philip and James and Andrew and Thomas are lifted a little bit out of obscurity by the fourth gospel. They're given a little bit of a personality. For example, the idea of Thomas as a doubter is only in the fourth gospel. So the identity of the apostles does not appear to be terribly important in the Gospels. There is, however, another reason that most of us cannot name the 12 apostles, and even those who raised your hands can't name the 12 apostles, is that the Gospels do not even agree on who the 12 are. They all agree that there were 12. The number 12 seems very important. Even Paul refers to the 12 in 1 Corinthians. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have a list of 12. They don't agree, but they have a list. John refers to the 12, but he never names them. And in the epilogue of John's Gospel, chapter 21, he refers to the 7 disciples. Part of the early identification of the Jesus movement was that they called themselves the New Israel. Israel had 12 tribes. The New Israel, they thought, had to have 12 tribes. And so Jesus says in the Synoptic Gospels to the 12 apostles, you will all sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. The number 12 appears to be important to the gospel writers. The makeup of the 12 does not appear to be important. Mark gives us the first list of the 12 apostles. Mark writes between 70 and 72. And in that list, Peter is always first. Judas Iscariot is last. And in that listing, in the 3rd chapter of Mark, about the year 72, the first mention of Judas Iscariot in the entire New Testament is made. Now, please note that this means that the name Judas Iscariot does not enter the Christian story until the 8th decade of the 1st century. Some 42 years after the crucifixion, we have the first mention of Judas Iscariot. Now, Mark and Matthew have identical lists in the identical order. And in their list, there's a disciple named Thaddeus. There's also a disciple named Simon, described as the Canaanian. But when you get to Luke, in both the Gospel and in the book of Acts, you discover that Thaddeus has disappeared from the list. And in his place, there is a second apostle whose name is Judas. His name is Judas, the son of James. Luke also changes Simon the Canaanian to Simon the Zealot. Then when you get to John, John refers to the number of 12, but he never names them. But you cannot read John without being aware that he considers one of the 12 to be a man named Nathanael, who plays a major role in John's gospel, who's called directly by Jesus into discipleship. And Nathanael doesn't appear to be heard of in any other gospel. And to go back to these zealots for a moment. The zealots were those who regularly engaged in guerrilla warfare against the Romans. That was their name. The Jews called them freedom fighters. The Romans called them terrorists. The zealotry movement was responsible for keeping that guerrilla warfare at a fever's pitch for the 36 years between the crucifixion and the year 66. And in the year 66 of this common era, that guerrilla warfare broke out into full-scale warfare against the Roman Empire. That is, 36 years after the crucifixion, war began between the Jews and the Romans. It began in the hills of Galilee. But the Romans were not content to fight on Jewish terrain. And so they marshaled their armies, and under a general named Titus, they surrounded and besieged Jerusalem. And the year 70, Jerusalem was sacked. I mean, the Romans went through Jerusalem like the Germans went through Berlin. The Russians went through Berlin at the end of World War II. Hardly a building left standing on its roots. That war appears to have continued, if you can believe Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, until in a place called Masada in the year 73, with food supplies gone and ammunition exhausted, the final Jewish fighters engaged in an act of suicide to keep from falling into the hands of the Romans. And Masada marked the end of that bitter war. Now, the fall of Jerusalem was a traumatic event in the life of both the Jews and in the life of the followers of Jesus, who happened also to have been Jews. That war effectively brought an end to the Jewish nation. It disappeared from the maps of human history. It had a brief revival around 135 under a man named Bar Kokhba, but then it was crushed once again. And the Jewish nation did not again appear on the maps of human history until 1948, when the Balfour Declaration of 1917 was finally implemented by the United Nations. And the state of Israel came anew into being. Now, there is no doubt that the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70 was interpreted by the Jewish followers of Jesus as God's punishment on the Orthodox party of the Jewish nation for their rejection of Jesus as their Messiah. And I suspect that the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70 of this common era also shaped both Christian history and Jewish history far more dramatically than any of us has yet imagined. More than anything else, all of the Gospels are written after the year 70, and they are written in the light of the year 70. Even those apocalyptic chapters in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the end of the world chapters, reflect the images of the fall of Jerusalem, the pain of that war, and describe the tensions that began to grow between the followers of Jesus who were Jews and the Orthodox party made up of the Sadducees, the chief priest, and the temple authorities. That tension was palpable prior to the fall of Jerusalem, but it went out of bounds after the fall of Jerusalem. And that is reflected particularly in the fourth gospel, where John, a Jewish writer, refers to the enemies of the Jesus movement simply as the Jews. And he refers to them with an air of despicable quality. He spits the name out of his mouth. And he did that despite the fact that the followers of Jesus were also Jews. Prior to the writing of the fourth gospel, however, the followers of Jesus, sometime around the year 88, and possibly as a result of a meeting called the Council of Jamnia, the followers of Jesus had been excommunicated from the synagogue. And there is always enormous tension and hostility when a religious fight winds up expelling one party or the other. And so the followers of Jesus had begun to think of the Jews not as people like themselves, but as their primary ecclesiastical enemy. Now, against that background, let me bring into focus the member of the apostolic band of 12 who is known as Judas Iscariot. I said a moment ago that the first mention of Judas Iscariot comes in the New Testament in the Gospel of Mark, written about 72, or about 2 years after the fall and destruction of Jerusalem. Now, what do we have about Judas Iscariot prior to the writings of Mark? Nothing. We don't have a lot of things to go to before Mark, but we have some, so let me go to them. I go to the authentic writings of Paul, who wrote between 51 and 64. What does Paul have to say that might throw light on this subject? Let me begin this by saying I became suspicious of the historicity of a person named Judas Iscariot some years ago. And my first reason for suspicion was his name. Judas is simply the Greek spelling of the name Judah. And Judah is the name of the Jewish nation. I thought it was just too convenient when the anti-hero of the Christian story bears the same name as the nation with whom the Christians were locked in a very tense struggle for survival. So I became suspicious. The second thing that fed my suspicion was that no place in the corpus of Paul's writing is there any hint that Paul had ever heard of the tradition that Jesus was betrayed by one of the 12. A study of Paul reveals that this is not just an argument from silence, but that Paul tells us enough to make it all but impossible that such an idea had ever been brought to his attention, that such an idea had ever occurred to him. Now, if Paul had never heard of the tradition that Jesus was betrayed by one of the 12, that would seem to imply that the Judas tradition did not develop until sometime after the death of Paul. And it opens the possibility for the first time to me that the character we call Judas Iscariot was itself part of the fallout of the destruction of Jerusalem. And to examine this possibility in some depth, let me take you to the epistle we call 1 Corinthians, written by Paul around the year 54 or 55, some 25 years after the crucifixion, some 15 to 18 years before the writing of the first gospel, Mark. In chapter 11 of that epistle, we find Paul talking about betrayal, the first time that word has been mentioned in any Christian writing we know of. Paul writes with these words, quote, "For I received of the Lord what I also handed down to you." I want to tell you that that is a formula that Paul will use only 2 times in his entire writing career. And it suggests that what he's about to impart is of grave significance. What he's about to tell is the authentic tradition that was handed on to him by the apostles, and that would include Peter. Paul tells us in the writing of the epistle to the Galatians, which is dated about 52, it's probably his second epistle, that Paul conferred with Peter 3 years after Paul's conversion. And most scholars date Paul's conversion anywhere between 1 and 6 years after the crucifixion. Adolf Harnack is the one that worked out that little detail. So if the conversion of Paul was 1 to 6 years after the crucifixion, and Paul conferred with Peter 3 years after his conversion, this means that the meeting between Peter and Paul would be dated somewhere between 4 and 9 years after the crucifixion. And that is as early as we can get. What was the content of Paul's message? What was it that he had received from the Lord that he needed to pass on to them? And this is what Paul says. That the Lord Jesus, on the night in which he was handed over is the literal translation of the word that we normally render betrayed. It literally means handed over. That could be betrayal, but it's a little bit softer and a little bit broader. And on the night in which Jesus was handed over, Paul says, Jesus took bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it and instituted the Eucharistic meal, which Paul said was joining in the celebration of Jesus' death, not his resurrection. The followers of Jesus were to reenact this common meal, says Paul, so that they might proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Now note these things about this brief piece from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. The word handed over or betrayed is used one other time in the Jewish scriptures. It was in the Septuagint, and the original Hebrew was translated into Greek. And that was the story when Joseph was handed over by his brothers, who formed a group of 12, we are told. And he was handed over into slavery by his brothers, sold to the Midianites or to the Ishmaelites, depending on which version of the story you're reading. They handed him over, they betrayed him, says this story in the book of Genesis, for 20 pieces of silver. Guess which brother of the 12 proposed this handing over for money action? It was the fourth son of Leah, Jacob's first wife, and his name was Judah. In Greek, it would be spelled Judas. And this Judah became the patriarch of the nation of Judah, called Judea in the New Testament. And this was also the name from which the word Jew was derived. Other things to note about this Pauline passage. There is no reference in this passage that this meal that Jesus instituted was in any way related to the Passover. That idea doesn't come until much later when the Gospels are written. And there is no suggestion in Paul that this handing over or this betrayal was at the hands of one of the 12. That's not there. And this conclusion is confirmed by Paul himself just 4 chapters later in the same epistle, now chapter 15, where Paul once again opens with that same formula. Quote, I handed on to you as of the first importance what I in turn had received. This is the authentic creation, the authentic tradition. And then Paul proceeds that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. Please remember when Paul wrote, there was only one Scripture, and that was the Hebrew Scriptures. There was no New Testament. And that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day, quote, in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. The 12. Paul says Jesus appeared to the 12 after the crucifixion. There was no defection. Judas was still there. Paul had clearly never heard of the tradition that one of the 12 was a traitor. And by the time Matthew writes his gospel, somewhere between the years 82 and 85, the risen Christ is going to appear only to the 11. The story of Judas appears to have entered the tradition well after the time of Paul, but certainly before Matthew writes. And this suggests to me that the tradition about Judas Iscariot was not original, that it was contrived, that it was created. And the idea that Judas had to be replaced to bring the symbol 12 back to its original meaning does not come about until about 95, when the book of Acts is written. And a man named Matthias is said to have been elected to take Judas' role among the 12. Judas Iscariot does not appear to have been an original part of the Christian story. And at the moment he does appear in the narrative, he has already been given the name Iscariot. We think Iscariot comes from the word Sicarius, which means political assassin. Judas Iscariot means Judas the assassin. The first time he appears in the Christian written tradition, his name has been besmirched by this story. My suspicions about Judas' historicity thus became rampant. But that's not all. The next thing that made me suspicious about the historicity of the character we call Judas Iscariot was to look at the gospel tradition and to note how the Judas story grows from Mark in the year about 72, to Matthew in the early 80s, to Luke in the late 80s to early 90s, and to John at the end of the 10th decade. All you have to do is to open the Bible and know the order and see how the story grows. The Judas story expands over those years, and in that expansion, Judas, the figure who bears the name of the nation of the Jews, also becomes more and more evil. Let me trace that roughly. Judas Iscariot, as I noted, is introduced in Mark chapter 3, about the year 72. It says of him, he is the one who betrays. Judas does not appear again in Mark until chapter 14, when he is said to have gone to the chief priest to betray Jesus. But what he actually betrays, what he plans to do, is simply not clear. They promise to give him money, says Mark's text, but there is no price that is set. It's a pretty loose arrangement. At the Last Supper, later in that same chapter, Jesus says in Mark, "One of you who eats at the table with me is going to betray me," but nobody is identified. No words are spoken. The idea that the traitor is also one who eats at the table of the Lord is mentioned in every gospel. But Judas does not get identified in person or by name until the last of the Gospels. Judas' final appearance in Mark is in the Garden of Gethsemane. There he arrives with an armed entourage that Mark says comes from, quote, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Please note, there are no Roman officials mentioned. It is into the hands of the temple authorities that one named Judas betrays Jesus according to the first gospel to be written. And the betrayal is done with a kiss. Now we go to Matthew and see what he adds to the story. It's only when you get to Matthew that the price is set, 30 pieces of silver. And when Jesus says in Matthew that someone eating at this table will betray me, Judas is made to speak. And he says, "Surely it is not I." And Jesus says to him, "You have said so." And Matthew then adds another biographical note. Judas repented, he said, and tried to return the money. The return was refused. And so Judas hurled the money into the temple and went out and hanged himself. Those are Matthew's additions to the story. Then along comes Luke. Luke adds a bit to this growing narrative. Luke tries to explain how it was that Judas could have done this. Satan had to have entered him. Luke has the text read. And when Judas comes to kiss Jesus in the act of betrayal in the garden, Luke has some conversation between Jesus and Judas that has never been in the text before. "Do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" And then they seize him and they lead him away. In the book of Acts, which Luke also wrote, we are told in a sermon attributed to Peter that Judas took the money and bought a piece of land and went out to inspect the land. And he fell down and he broke open and all his bowels gushed out. I know it's a little soon after lunch for that, but that's what the text says. All his bowels gushed out. So that's what Luke adds to the story. I don't believe your bowels gush out when you're hung or hanged. So you got a different tradition. Maybe it's a bit gorier. And then you come to John. And John says, someone at this table is going to betray me, and the beloved disciple says, who is it, Lord? And Jesus says, it's the one to whom I give this piece of bread after I've dipped it into the common food supply. And he takes it and dips it and he gives it to Judas. It's hard to miss that. John also says, Satan entered him. And Judas leaves. He is not there for that first Eucharist. And when he goes out, John says, it was night. Darkness is a powerful theme of evil in John's gospel. Now that's the biblical story of Judas. It grows over the years from Mark to John, and it becomes darker. Now we take these details and examine him. Who is this Judas? He is one who breaks bread at the table of the Lord. That's mentioned 4 times. He's one who is betrayed with a kiss. That's mentioned 4 times. He's a traitor who receives 30 pieces of silver and who tries to hurl it back into the temple. That's mentioned only once. He's a traitor who goes out and hangs himself. That's mentioned only once. He's a traitor whose bowels gush out on the land. That's mentioned only once. Now let me take that data and go back into the Hebrew Scriptures and look at every story of a traitor that we can find in those Hebrew Scriptures. And we will discover that every detail in the Judas story can be found in one of these earlier Jewish traitor stories, making it look like Judas is a composite of the Old Testament traitors that would be known to the authors. Let me tell you about them. One is a man named Ahithophel. You can't even use him on a crossword puzzle. Ahithophel was a confidant of King David, who was called the Lord's anointed. That's what the king was, the anointed one. That's what the word Messiah originally meant. It was originally a name for the king. And Ahithophel is a trusted advisor who eats at the table of the Lord's anointed, King David. One of the Psalms says, one who ate at my table has raised his hand against me, referring to the story of Ahithophel who betrayed King David. When Ahithophel's treachery turned out not to work out, we are told in the text, and this is in Samuel, that Ahithophel went out and hanged himself. Then we move to Zechariah, actually 2nd Zechariah. Chapters 9 through 14 are written about 100 years after chapters 1 through 8. And in 2nd Zechariah, the shepherd king of Israel is betrayed or bought off for 30 pieces of silver, which is then hurled back into the temple. And those to whom this shepherd king was betrayed were those who bought and sold animals in the temple. One of the messianic signs, according to the book of Zechariah, and this is chapter 14, is that when the day of the Lord comes, when the messianic age begins, there will no longer be those who buy and sell animals in the temple, which puts the cleansing of the temple story into a very different context. And then there's the kiss of the traitor. That is also found in the David cycle of stories. David has put down a civil war led by his son Absalom. David begins to doubt the loyalty of his chief military officer, General Joab. And so David decides to replace General Joab with his own appointment, General Amasa. Joab is not pleased. Joab decides that he needs to go confront Amasa and, quote, to congratulate him on his appointment, unquote. He searches through the land to find him, and finally he comes upon him. And Joab, approaching him as a friend, grabs him by the beard and pulls his face close to Joab's face to give him the kiss of friendship. And with his right hand and a dagger, he disembowels Amasa. His bowels gush all over the ground. So if you analyze the biblical data, you will discover that the Judas story is not particularly original. That Judas may be a symbol for the Jewish people who were divided from the followers of Jesus by enormous hostility and persecution at this point, and it was in both directions. And that Judas grows more sinister as the Gospels develop, and that at the same time, Pontius Pilate, the symbol of the Roman Empire, grows more and more sympathetic. And I could trace that too, but I don't have time. All of which makes me suspicious that the character we meet in the Gospel called Judas the assassin, Judas Iscariot, is nothing more than a literary creation, a composite of the traitor stories of the Old Testament developed by the followers of Jesus as an attempt to shift the blame for the death of Jesus from the Romans, who were surely the guilty party, to the Jews, with whom the Christians were in such deep tension. So let me speculate a little bit as to how it was that Judas came to be created as the traitor, if my supposition is correct. The first Christians were Jews. These first Christians believed that God had spoken in the Judeo tradition to them in a new way, in the Jewish Jesus. And in the early years following the crucifixion, they were engaged in the task of incorporating Jesus into the ongoing Jewish story, just as every prophet had been incorporated. Amos was incorporated, Hosea was incorporated, Jonah was incorporated, Malachi was incorporated. The tradition was always living, always moving. But religious people are pretty much all the same. Anytime you incorporate a new thing into an ongoing tradition, there's going to be some resistance. That's just sort of normal for religious people. So the followers of Jesus were revisionist Jews, and the opposition were Orthodox Jews. And I can take you to many a Christian church today and show you a great division between the fundamentalist Christians and the progressive Christians. And sometimes they save their deepest hostility for one another. I've received 16 death threats in my life, never from a Jew or an atheist or a Buddhist. All of my death threats came from Bible-quoting, true-believing fundamentalists. There's something about religion that brings hostility to a fever pitch. So in the synagogue, we had revisionist Jews versus Orthodox Jews. The revisionist Jews were trying to incorporate some new things into Judaism. The Orthodox party was resisting this incorporation. The temple authorities felt like all fundamentalists feel, that no revision is ever necessary, no new idea is ever worthwhile. Traditional religious thinking is always sufficient. Now, the tensions between the two groups were real but manageable until the war broke out in 66. And the Orthodox party was generally assumed to be supportive of that war. It was a zealotry religious war. But the revisionist Jews were not supportive of that war. And what resulted in that war was quite horrible. Not only did the Romans conquer the city and destroy the temple, they repopulated the city. They moved the Jews out and moved pagans in. They built a holy place on the spot where the temple had once stood. And the Roman victors were expressing enormous hostility toward the Jews for causing this war in the first place. So when Jerusalem was destroyed, the Jews no longer had a capital city. When the temple was destroyed, they no longer had a dwelling place for their God. When their nation disappeared from the maps of human history, they no longer had a homeland. And the Orthodox party was largely blamed for this war and their support of the Zealots movement. So the ability of the Orthodox party to tolerate a revisionist possibility almost disappeared. And the revisionists, as all people do in religious conflict, began to rub it in. They began to say, well, the only reason the Romans have won this war and destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple is that God is punishing you stiff-necked people because you rejected Jesus. I'm sure that was really an appreciated message. And the Roman persecution of all Jews was intense. And the revisionist Jews wanted to find some way to separate themselves from the Jews who were deemed by the Romans to be responsible for this war. They wanted to separate themselves from those that the Romans were so intent upon oppressing. How do you do that? Well, how better to do that than in your sacred story to whitewash Pilate, the name of the Roman government, and to vilify the Orthodox Jews and to claim that they, not the revisionists, they were responsible not just for the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, but they were also responsible for the death of Jesus. And that meant that the revisionist Jews had the same enemy that the Romans had. They did this by creating a symbol of the Orthodox party and by giving him the name of the Jewish nation, by creating him as the assassin. And they used this to court Roman favor by saying that the enemy of the Romans is also the enemy of the followers of Jesus. So Judas became the way that the followers of Jesus transferred the blame for the death of Jesus from the Romans, where it surely belonged, to the Jews who would be persecuted throughout all of history for this sleight of hand shift. And it was in that act, in the creation of Judas Iscariot, that the anti-Semitism, which is the darkest stain on the Christian soul, was born. And the anti-Semitism that has hurt and killed and ghettoized Jewish people throughout the centuries. I think the time has come for Christians to stop saying he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, as if Pontius Pilate was an innocent bystander, and say he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, for no one had the authority to crucify except the Roman government. And at the same time, I think the time has come for Christians to bow in humility and to beg forgiveness of the Jewish people for what we Christians have done to them in the name of our Jewish Jesus. Thank you very much. How much time? Thank you very much. We've got about 20 minutes. We'll follow the same procedure. Every other question comes from a lady. Please approach the microphones. I'd like once again to ask you, if you're willing, whether you get your question asked publicly or not, if you're willing to write out your question and to sign your name and place of residence and give it to me or to my wife or to Joan or to anybody that'll get it to me, so that I might possibly use those questions in future columns, which I write once a week. If anybody's interested in the column, there's a place somewhere you can sign up to receive it. With that, I recognize the First Lady.
Thank you.
Michelle.
Gretel.
No, you're not Michelle.
I'm Gretel.
Who's the other First Lady?
Oh, that one. Bishop Spong, when you speak about your Christian path as a path, that you look to bring you deeper in your understanding, into your understanding of God's love and mystery, but not necessarily the path, recognizing other faiths as ways to reach that sort of enlightenment. I wonder how you talk about the text of John 14:6, which is actually etched into the hall of Christ across the grass. I am the way and the truth and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. And I'm asking you this because I've heard it as part of the liturgy of 2 funerals that I've attended in Catholic churches this past year. And the interfaith makeup of the congregation, because these people were beloved to more than just people of their own faith, made me sort of more acutely aware of the exclusionary tone of these words by a man that I always think of as more humble and inclusive. And I'm wondering, when you were speaking yesterday about the black, gray, red, and pink, I'm wondering...
by the time you get to it. Go
yeah,
ahead.
but I'm wondering if that has any bearing on this, if this is actually Jesus' words or if it's someone else's.
John 14 is regularly quoted. It would take me too long to unload that text, but that doesn't mean what people think it means. I've got a book coming out in 2014 on John's Gospel. It'll take me about 350 pages
Okay, I'll read it.
to answer that. Let me just sort of say to that no biblical scholar I know of believes that Jesus said any of the I am statements that occur only in John. I am the bread, I am the living water, I am the vine, I am the gate, I am the resurrection, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Those are all statements of the community being oppressed to affirm that they hold the truth. But go back to the immediate question. I don't know how anybody can tell God what the only path to God is. What kind of arrogance is that? Am I going to limit God by the limits of my religious vision? I'm happy to say that I walk a pathway that leads me into the mystery of God, and it's the Christ pathway. I would never say that that's the pathway everybody's got to walk because that's the only pathway that'll get you there. That's human arrogance. That's idolatry. No human being could put God into the box of his own or her own religious tradition. So it becomes, even for somebody to claim that, is arrogance beyond my comprehension. I don't understand religious people. Can you imagine an insect trying to describe to a fellow insect what it's like to be a bird? Can you imagine a horse trying to describe to another horse what it's like to be a human being? What makes any of us think that an insect could actually develop a frame of reference to be able to understand a bird? Or a horse to be able to develop a frame of reference that would allow them to understand what it's like to be human? And why in the world does any human being think that they have the ability to tell another human being who God is or what God is. And it's always a power play. It's always part of what I think the religious syndrome's deepest sin is. And that is to say to other people, I'm okay, you're not okay, and you're not going to be okay until you're just like me. And that's always arrogant.
Thank you.
So I'd like to get rid of conversion behavior and missionary behavior because all of it is based on that theory. I've got the answer, you don't, and I'm going to give it to you. And I think that only creates hostility. And I don't believe you can create the love of God by communicating with hostility to another person. Anyway, thank you for your question. Oh, a gentleman. I'm supposed to go from mic to mic. So I'll come to a lady next over here. Yes.
Yes, first I would just like to thank both of you for putting on such an excellent vacation Bible school. And my question is, I wonder if you could satisfy our curiosity, what kind of Christianity would fill you with the kind of affection and respect for Christianity that you would like to feel?
Well, that's a wonderful question, but I don't know how in the world you answer that in a question and answer format. I spent my life wrestling with that, and my book titles will show you what piece of that I'm wrestling with at the moment. But let me just try to answer it briefly by saying that people frequently ask me if I can define God, and I obviously can't define God. But what I think I can define is what I believe my experience of God is. That's something I can own. Now, as I said earlier this week, I may be delusional. And I've worked in mental institutions. I know that there are a lot of people that talk to God very frequently, and they're absolutely loony. I might be loony, but I don't think so. So when I try to describe my experience of God, I do it in terms of 3 words. I believe God is the source of life, the life that flows through the universe, the life that was born some 3.8 billion years ago in a single cell, the life that animates everything that is, every plant, every mushroom, every creature, every great ape, every human being. I believe God is the source of life. And if I believe that God is the source of life, then it seems to me that the only way I can worship God is by living fully. And the more fully I live, the more I believe I can make the God who is the source of life visible. Secondly, I believe I experience God as the source of love. And if God is the source of love, then the only way I can worship God is by loving wastefully, never stopping to count the cost, never trying to describe who is worthy of that love, just giving it away. My image is a sink in the basement of your home. You plug up the 2 or 3 drains and you turn on all the faucets, and the water overflows the boundaries of that old sink and spills out all over the floor and fills up every dirty crack and cranny in your basement. And it never stops to ask whether that crack or cranny deserves to be filled. Wasteful love. The kind of love with which I love Christine. And the more deeply I love, the more I believe I make this God visible. I can't love when I'm putting down other people who might disagree with me. And the third word, and it's a little more complex, I studied under a theologian named Paul Tillich, who defined God as the ground of being. And I like that definition. Not a being, but the ground of being. If God is the ground of being, then the only way I can worship God is by having the courage to be everything that I'm capable of being. And the more deeply and fully I can become myself, fully human, the more I believe I will make God manifest, visible. And you see, I also believe that only when I can accept myself as I am can I be free to accept other people just as they are without trying to impose my agenda upon them, whether it's a religious agenda or a political agenda or without trying to make Boston Red Sox fans like the Yankees. So it's in the fullness of living and loving and being that I practice God. Now, I add one thing to that, because I walk the Christ path. And the reason I walk the Christ path is twofold. One, I was raised in it. It's the faith of my fathers and mothers. But secondly, by walking the Christ path, I look at the picture of Jesus that comes to me through the tradition and through the scriptures, and I find the portrait of one who was fully alive. I find the portrait of one who was completely, wastefully loving. I find the portrait of one who had the courage to be all that he could be, whether he was being hailed as the king on Palm Sunday or nailed to the cross on Good Friday. And so when I look at that life, I say, that's what God looks like to me. Fully alive, totally loving, free to be, and free to give life and love and being away. And that to me is what the Christian faith is all about. And I suspect that that's as short a definition I can give to that good but difficult question. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, Bishop. I'm an Episcopal priest in this diocese, and I was wondering if you could give a word of advice and encouragement to all of the lay people and the priests and ministers who are going to return to their homes and try to lead Bible studies in light of your wonderful research. Help.
Well, I'm afraid what most Bible study, and I don't mean this pejoratively, what most Bible study amounts to is that people get together and pool their corporate ignorance. And I think the burden is on the priest.
Okay.
I think that the priest has one thing to give to the congregation, and that is a 3-year theological education. I wonder why you don't share it. Now, I know that when you share it, that there's always going to be reaction, because you're then a revisionist versus a traditionalist. And so you're disturbing the faithful. So I think you've got to be careful where you share it and how you share it. I don't think you ought to share it from the pulpit. People can't talk back from the pulpit. They normally can't throw hymn books at you. They are put in the place of passive receptors. And I think if you're going to deal with new ideas and troubling concepts, you have to do it in a context where they can process it and question it and challenge it. And I would say that if we want to do anything about adult education in our churches, we've got to take it into a classroom setting where you can provide your own expertise and where you can give them opportunity to challenge, to question, to object, to do anything they want to do. And you've got to respect where they are in that process, but you keep doing it. The wonderful thing about teaching an adult class in a congregation, and I still do that in my own congregation in Morristown a few Sundays every year, the great thing about that is that the next week you sort of start over and refresh where you were last week, and it's sort of like indoctrination. Every week you sort of start over. And after a while, they think they invented these things. They've heard it so often. They think it's part of theirs. When I was the bishop and would publish a book, and there'd be a howl in the traditional press about this book, which is revisionist Christianity, they'd talk to somebody in the Diocese of New York and say, well, we heard that years ago. There's nothing new about that. Well, what I'm trying to do is communicate to people that what I'm delivering to you is stuff that's been alive in the Christian Academy for about 200 years. We just have not allowed it to trickle down. And the bottleneck, with all due respect to your profession and mine, the bottleneck is overwhelmingly the clergy. And I, as a bishop, have gotten to the place when a clergyman tells me, if I do that, it's going to upset my congregation, I now believe the only person who's really going to be upset is that priest. I don't believe you can insult the intelligence of lay people Sunday after Sunday after Sunday and not drive your church to the place where the only lay people you've got are rather placid, dependent, and unwilling ever to ask a question. So I think if you open that process, you'll discover that out there in radio land, as the radio evangelists say, out there in radio land, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are waiting for somebody to give them permission to think in the Christian church. And if you do that, I almost guarantee you that there'll be a response. And I know your diocese a little bit, and historically it's always been a diocese that's had an open, progressive bishop. So you ought to be thankful for that. Well, I don't know the present one, but up until then, I've known him for a long time up until then. But thank you for your question.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Hi. How do you reconcile the overflowing love you described with some of the real monsters and evil, truly evil people, Hitlers? How do you not judge some of those cracks and crevices?
Well, I think the way you deal with Hitler is you confront him, which the Christian church in its leadership certainly didn't do. I think Pius XII was negligent in his responsibility. Certainly the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Germany was negligent, so much so that the one or two people who stood up to Hitler, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who paid for his stand by being hanged by the Nazis in Flossenburg in 1945, about 2 weeks before the Allied armies got there, or a man named Martin Niemöller. We know the objectors by name because there were so few of them. And we also know that that England and Canada and the United States were aware of what was going on in Europe, in Germany. And for various reasons, they did nothing about it. They wouldn't even bomb the railroad lines to the Holocaust camps. Now, you can be very judgmental when you look back on history. If you read American history, you will know that President Roosevelt, who was president at that time, was dealing with a lot of political issues. He had a Catholic priest on the radio who was sort of the Rush Limbaugh of his day. His name was Conklin, Charles Conklin. Just putting this hostility against Roosevelt out into the bloodstream every day in the same way that Limbaugh does, and others, Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly. I like Bill O'Reilly, and I know that's difficult for people to understand. I've been on his program 8 times. We disagree strongly, but I've always liked him. And on one of those occasions, I said on national television, Bill, you're nothing but Rush Limbaugh with perfume. And he still invited me back. But we've got those voices. There's an enormous amount of negativity that's poured into the bloodstream, and there's an enormous amount of negativity that will be poured into the life of a priest who's trying to communicate these things. I think you confront evil wherever it is. And sometimes the evil is in the heart of the religious people. My friends, the battle we've gone through in my church over justice for gay and lesbian people, the primary enemy was not the secular society. The primary enemy was in the soul of the church, who kept quoting the Bible as if the Bible told them that homosexuality was wrong. That's what I call very selective quotations. I tried to do that on the first day to tell you, if you're going to treat the Bible literally, you better read it. And most people who quote it don't read it, and that's a tragedy. I sort of resent being attacked by fundamentalists for not treating the Bible seriously, when that's the primary thing I spend my life studying so that I can communicate its message. And it's not a message of God hates queers. You'd think that. And I think you confront that. I think you confront that pastor down in Florida that wanted to have a book burning and burn the Koran. I think you confront that. I think you confront people in government at every level when what they're doing violates the humanity of any child of God. You may die in the process, but that's okay. I think I would rather die with my integrity than live as a compromised human being. And that's the quality of leadership that I just think is important. Yes, sir. Whoever.
A woman. You're acutely aware that New York State voted to allow same-sex marriage.
Yes.
And I am the pastor of an open and affirming church, and I wrote an editorial in the paper and received for the very first time in my life, in my career, hate emails, hate phone calls, hate letters.
Well, welcome.
And it was a sucker punch to me. I was not prepared for it.
Yeah.
And you have done this for so long and so bravely, and I wanted to ask if you would speak a little bit on bravery.
Thank you. I wish I could embody it. I remember when Martin Luther King led the march from Selma, that I was maybe 26 years old and serving a church in eastern North Carolina, a very segregated community. So I wasn't with Martin Luther King, but I tried to find a way to identify with him, so I made the opening hymn that morning, "Lead on, O King Eternal." But nobody got it. Now, it took me a long time to find my legs. When the Supreme Court ordered the desegregation of the schools in Tarboro, that was my little town, and I dearly love that little town. 7,500 people, 50% black, 50% white, divided by Panola Street right down the middle, so that never the twain shall meet. It was like mass hysteria. I can't tell you how deep racism is and how deep it afflicts the soul. And you would have thought that the end of the world was near. You would have thought that there'd be no white child safe in any school from that day on. And what we were doing is taking in 4 little children under 8. You know, you would have thought Nazis were moving their Panzer divisions in by the reaction. And I went to the sheriff, who was a good man named Tom Barden and a member of my church. And I said, "Tom, I need to know that you have got the power to protect those children. Because if you aren't, I'm going to escort those children in and you're going to have to arrest me." Well, I don't know that would have been such a big problem for Tom. He could have probably arrested me. But what I was trying to do was simply to stiffen his backbone. And he gave me his assurance those children would be safe. And he did escort them in. And they were white Christians. I'm sure they were Christians because everybody in Tarboro was a Christian. Nobody in that little town would say, "I don't believe in God," or "I'm not a Christian." It was just, what kind of Christian are you? You're Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Pentecostal, whatever. And he walked them in, and these Christians lined up, and they were cussing, and they were spitting on these little children. And those children walked in, and it was as if the problem was over. You know, none of those children raped any white children. None of those children killed any white children. And it was as if reality finally got into their fears. But I came to a very deep appreciation of how badly racism had warped my soul and warped the souls of really good people in that town. I had a man in that town who would have become viscerally ill. He would have thrown up if he had had to eat at a table with a person of color. He couldn't have helped it. And I tried to find out how he got to be that way. And so I was talking to him one time. He had a nickname, Tish. I said, "Tish, tell me where all this feeling comes from." And he said, "Well, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, we had a contest in my school, and I won the contest, and I was so pleased and happy and proud. And they called me forward, and they gave me the prize, and it was a picture of Abraham Lincoln. And I walked home, and I was so pleased that I had been the winner of this contest, and when I got home, I showed my mother, and she whipped me." Can you imagine that? That's how deep the fear was. This is in the 1960s, and Abraham Lincoln had been dead quite a long time. You know, even Democrats quote Abraham Lincoln after a few years, and Republicans quote Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's just sort of interesting, but they got to be dead a while. But this is 80 years, almost 100 years after Abraham Lincoln, and that feeling was still there because it had been reinforced in every generation. And I think you've got to love those people while you confront them. And that's not always easy. But anyway, I don't know how to be brave. I became active in the gay movement because I met some incredibly wonderful gay and lesbian people. And they violated every one of my stereotypes. They weren't mentally ill and they weren't morally depraved. They were fantastic, creative people. And so my stereotype began to shatter. And then because I'm an overdeveloped left brain and an underdeveloped right brain, I contacted some doctors at the Cornell School of Medicine that I knew, one in particular named Robert Lahita. And I said, Bob, how would you like to educate a bishop? Well, they'd never had a bishop before that wanted to be educated. That was a new thing. We used to say of bishops, they either grow or swell. And I've known them in both directions. But I went over to the Cornell Center, and I worked with Bob Lahita, and I worked with the other doctors, and I read everything they had, and I became as convinced as they were that homosexuality is not a choice, it's a given, that it's one more aspect in the variety of human beings. Some of us have red hair, some of us have black hair, some of us have blonde hair, some of us are left-handed, some of us are right-handed, some of us are heterosexual, some of us are homosexual, some of us are bisexual. That's a given. You can't create it, you can't change it. It's one of the aspects of our humanity. And once that became very clear to me, then there's no possibility that I can compromise on the integrity and humanity of another child of God. And I said to people, if that upsets you, too bad. And I even published something on the web, you can still find it if you want to, called My Manifesto. If you go online and say Spong Manifesto, you'll get it. In which I said, I'm not even going to argue with people about it anymore. I'm assuming that we're going to walk into a new consciousness on this issue, and I'm not interested in debating. And I did this after somebody on CNN, I can't remember who, had a debate between a gay soldier who had just been kicked out of the military and some Bible-quoting stupid woman. And they did it in the name of fair play, that they had to have both sides of the issue. And I wrote to CNN and said, if you're debating whether or not the earth is flat, would you still offer both sides of the question? I mean, didn't there come a time when an issue gets settled? And so I, in a fit of rage, wrote something called My Manifesto, and it went out on my column the next Thursday. And within 24 hours, it had been replicated about 1 million times and was circling the globe. And I still get letters from it. It just appears in a new place somewhere. So I don't think it takes courage, but I think you do have to know who you are. And you do have to be willing to face the pain for the sake of the witness to truth. When I retired as the bishop, I had 35 out-of-the-closet gay and lesbian clergy serving openly in our diocese, and 31 of them lived openly with their partners. And I've never had a complaint about their misbehavior, including their sexual behavior. And I wish I could say that about my heterosexual clergy. Thank you.
I know to keep this very short, so in fact, I'll let you answer this in your column if you wish. But I also want to say to people who need Bible study, the Living the Questions is a wonderful resource. I've been using that and bringing in people from outside the church who've never been in a church, so thank you for that, and if you haven't considered that in your churches, please do. The question I have for you is that you have painted the most horrific story of the power of propaganda that I've heard in my life. It bests what the Nazis did in the 1930s. Now, as pastor, as bishop, as wise elder, I'd really rather not be a Bonhoeffer, and I don't think it's going to be that effective because I think our churches need to be standing up to the power of Fox News. And I'm scared out of my wits. And I know that Dr. Campbell has been writing and speaking eloquently on this, but practically, how can we bring our churches with us in countering this pernicious power? And again, I know that you have to go, so if this is a question you want to answer in your column, I can't wait. But it's a scary time for us.
Well, let me say that one of the tragedies among church people is they think they've got to have a majority to move. If you read the Bible carefully, you'll find that all it calls for is a saving remnant. You are to be not the majority. You're to be the leaven in the loaf. You're to be the salt in the soup. You're to be the light in the darkness. So I think we've got to get over our majority mentality. And secondly, I think the church ought not to be afraid of controversy. Controversy in the service of a powerful truth is pretty important. People say, well, you're going to kill the church with controversy. Folks, the church is going to die of boredom long before it dies of controversy. Controversy is actually a life sign. Controversy says there's some power here, there's some integrity here. I've just recently visited a little church, United Church of Christ, down in Hendersonville, North Carolina, one of the greatest congregations I've ever been a part of. It's maybe the only Christian church in that part of the mountains of western North Carolina that isn't fundamentalist. That's part of the territory. Every time you go around a curve, there's a sign that says, prepare to meet your God. And just around you get around the curve, it says, Jesus saves. I saw one church there that had a big sign out front that said, don't let the next time you come to church be when 6 strong men carry you in. It's that kind of fundamentalist mountain reality. And this little church, about 200 people, is sort of the only non-fundamentalist church down there. And they just had this big statewide referendum on gay marriage. And all the religious establishment, from Billy Graham to Franklin Graham to local pastors, came out beating the Bible in favor of denying equality to gay and lesbian people. And this single church took out an ad and ran it every other day in the Hendersonville, North Carolina little local paper, stating their opposition to this and saying why. And they were excoriated by the other clergy. But they had all kinds of people that decided they wanted to go to that church because it stood for something. And I think that's what we need to recover. And if you're ever in Hendersonville, some people from Hendersonville here. And here they are over here in the corner. Talk to them. That's a wonderful, wonderful community. Thank you all, and I'll see you tomorrow.